Hello and welcome to another edition of World Talks here on TVP World. I'm your host Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guests on this next interview. Brussels has approved a €90 billion loan for Ukraine, while also advancing its 20th sanction package against Russia. The funding comes as Kyiv seeks rapid disbursement to bolster its army and domestic arms production. Joining us today on TVP World to unpack what this means for Ukraine and Europe is Iryna Krasnoshtan, Program Director at the International Center for Ukrainian Victory, Specialist in International Support Mechanism and Ukraine's Recovery Strategy. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So looking at this €90 billion loan, can you help us understand how exactly will this be divided and prioritized across defense, social needs, as well as domestic production?
Yes, first of all, it's a very positive sign for us because finally the loan is unblocked. We have been waiting for months for this decision to happen. So I'm just taking a small moment to note that this is a positive news. The 90 billion is first of all divided into 2 years because it's for this year and for the next year. So we will have 45 billion for each year allocated. And then basically, more or less, it is supposed to be divided 60% for defense issues and 40% will be covering financial needs, budgetary needs of Ukraine, so social supports, pensions, some of the salaries of civil servants and so on. And for the defense, it's also, I think it will include several things. Of course, some of this money will be allocated for Ukrainian domestic production. As we know, I mean, defense sector in Ukraine has been developing, but it is still very much underfunded. So our capacities to produce are much higher. So there is need for additional resources there. And this loan is also supposed to cover some joint production initiatives. We have signed a lot of different agreements with different European partners lately. So I think some of the money will be allocated on this joint project. And there is another crucial need is, of course, air defense for Ukraine, air defense against the ballistic missiles, so Patriot interceptors. And I know that Ukrainian president has underlined that he would really want to use some of this money to be able to buy some interceptors, more interceptors for Ukraine. But again, this will not come in one big amount in one day. So I think the idea is that it will be dispersed in some tranches. Hopefully, the first one will come already somewhere in the beginning of June.
Right. And of course, we're talking about a very massive support package here. Are there any mechanism in place to ensure transparency and the efficacy of the spending?
Yes, absolutely. It's a big amount of money, but as I mentioned, it will not be coming as one big tranche of money, so it will be dispersed in smaller amounts. I'm not sure at this point of time which will be the mechanism for this specific loan, but I can provide some examples in the past of how Ukraine was ensuring transparency, because it was done on bilateral basis. For example, there were different programs of tracking military equipment provided for Ukraine. For the financial resources, Ministry of Finances has been reporting on the use of the funds, and I think there were also external audits involved. And in what concerns, for example, European funds, for the big program, which is called Ukraine Facility, that EU established several years ago. EU has formed so-called the audit board, so EU external audit board that was regularly checking, ensuring the funds are being used in a transparent and efficient way. So I think that most likely European Union will also establish some sort of an audit board for this loan as well.
Right now, the EU is borrowing capital market to fund this support, but then there's also a possibility that Ukraine might not be able to pay this back. But there's also the idea of potentially utilizing Russian assets as well. How likely do you think that the European Union will be able to get back at least some of this money?
Well, it's actually quite clear when the decision was taken that Ukraine will not be paying this loan back. So it was already included in the original document that it will not be on Ukraine to pay back the European Union. So the original idea is that Russia will eventually pay back for the loan. Or as you mentioned, the Russian frozen assets that sit right now in the European countries will be used to repay this loan. But I think, it's the concept is very important in this regards. That yes, at this point of time, it will be EU making, but that eventually it will be Russia who will bear responsibility for these funds. Because I think that sometimes when we speak about this war, we now tend to forget this kind of accountability aspect of it, and I think it's very important. And it has been used also by the US for quite some time. So I think by taking this step, the European Union takes also kind of more ownership on this issue, because basically there was a moment of time in which US was trying to kind of use this money as a leverage with Russia, saying that, maybe they will release back this money to Russia, which is not the right thing to do. And I think right now, European Union will kind of, with this decision, make sure that this money will not be returned to Russia just as a gesture of goodwill, so that it will be used later to repay the loan.
Right, so essentially, we're also tying Europe's finances and have a vested interest now in seeing that the Ukraine wins, or at least take account into these Russian frozen assets.
That Russia is held accountable for that in the future.
Definitely. Now, speaking of holding Russia accountable, there's also being announced the 20th sanction package. How do you see this ongoing sanction, now the 20th package, impacting Russia's war capacity in real terms?
Well, there is always a discussion about whether the sanctions are an efficient tool or inefficient tool, but I think that sanctions are working. But of course, Russia has been very elaborately finding the ways to finding the loops and the ways to overcome some of the sanctions. And of course, as always, when we talk about the measures taken by the EU, it's a compromise among what the different nations can agree to. So we always have a little bit lower common denominator than maybe, Ukraine or some of the partners would wish to see. So this sanctions package also comes quite late. So we understand that this is the version that has been worked on in previous months, because it was supposed to be agreed back in February. As always, there are additional measures on energy companies, on Russian shadow fleet, and on other things. So it's important. I think that Russia is suffering from it. But of course, Russia is always being creative, so we always need to monitor actually the implementation of the sanctions to make sure that it is being more efficient.
Right, I'm most curious about the event like the Kyiv Security Forum. Can you help us understand how important that is with figures like Prince Harry showing up and drawing global attention?
Well, absolutely. On one hand, it's a long-standing security forum that has been happening for many years, and it's always been attracting quite high-level people on the security issues. But of course, especially in war times, and the significance of it is growing. And when we see some high-level officials and some high-level figures, as you mentioned, Prince Harry coming to Ukraine, it also has a bigger symbolic value, because we know that Getting to Ukraine these days is not that easy. It takes quite a dedication for people to get on the trains, to take the long journey, to come under the attacks, because we know that, for example, train infrastructure is also being attacked recently by Russia. So coming under the threats of missiles attacks, drones attacks, and so on, it's very important, and it's a message for the larger community across the world that the war continues. Ukraine continues to stand against Russia. Russia continues the attacks. Even today I see that you're showing the pictures. We had another attack that killed civilians in different places in Ukraine. So I think it brings additional attention to the world, especially with the developments in Iran that took over quite a lot of news across the world. It brings attention to this European war.
Right, and speaking of involving the rest of the world, we also saw the EU-Ukraine Business Summit taking place in Brussels, where Ukraine and the European Union signed over 1 billion euros in deals as Kyiv and Brussels move to more kind of tightly interweave their economies. But like we see on the screen, the war is still going on as well. Do you think Ukraine will realistically be able to attract some major investment with the continued missile and drone attacks going on?
Well, you see, there is a large interest, and actually from the partners from different European states, but also from Middle East states in Ukraine, and especially these days in Ukraine defense technologies. But of course, with other sectors, it's more complicated. But for a long time, there has been certain amount of interest, and especially in recovery and reconstruction projects in Ukraine. So despite the risk, there is attention and interest, maybe not of the amount that would have been happening under normal circumstances. But on the defense side, I understand at this summit there was an agreement reached between EU and Ukrainian Ministry of Defense on some of the additional investments in developing new defense technologies, like innovative projects. So I think it's a positive sign, and that's where the most of attention these days is.
Okay, last but not least, do you see that there's any sort of chance for any direct talk between high-level leaders between Ukraine, Russia, Zelensky and Putin, for example, and perhaps maybe Europe can take the lead in these negotiations?
Well, I am rather pessimistic on that because I will explain that because we haven't seen any willingness on Russian side to engage in this format. It has been offered several times to Vladimir Putin and his team, but he hasn't been accepting any of these suggestions. Ukrainian side offered different locations. I understand Turkey was one of the best possible places, and Turkish president has been also highly involved in trying to leverage that happening, but we do not see any signals on that side. But it also is directly related to the fact that also the American team has been rather focused on the Middle East and the war in Iran. So I think the negotiations have not been progressing much in these last weeks. But to your point about European involvement, I actually think that Europe should be more involved, but it needs a more clear strategy on the European side, because we often see that Europe is involved, but there are different people involved, different leaders in different formats and different meetings. But I think that Europe needs to perhaps appoint one person who would be representing it, European Union at these negotiations, and would be able to be more, maybe not on a daily basis, but on a more regular basis, to be more involved in this.
All right, so we'll have to see how that goes. But in the meantime, thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me.
Cheers. And thank you for tuning into this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.